The water reached the cabin door on the morning of April 7, 1853, rising faster than anyone had predicted. Inside, Thomas Brennan watched through his window as every cabin in the valley flooded except his own, protected by the trench his neighbors had called a waste of time. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Thomas Brennan arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1851 with everything he owned loaded on 2 pack mules. He was 28 years old, unmarried, and determined to build a life in the wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. The Bitterroot Valley offered everything a homesteader needed: timber for building, game for hunting, soil for planting, and water from creeks that ran clear and cold from the mountains. Thomas selected a site near one of these creeks, a flat piece of ground shaded by ponderosa pines, and began building his cabin. He followed the construction methods every frontiersman knew. He cut logs from nearby trees, notched them at the corners, and stacked them into walls. He chinked the gaps with mud and moss. He built a simple door from split planks and hung it on leather hinges. He laid poles across the top for roof beams and covered them with bark and sod. The entire structure took him 9 days to complete, working alone. When he finished, he had a cabin that measured 12 feet by 14 feet with a dirt floor, 1 small window, and a stone fireplace he had built in one corner. It was adequate shelter, and Thomas was proud of what he had accomplished. He spent the summer and fall establishing his homestead. He cleared land for a small garden. He hunted elk and deer, smoking the meat for winter supplies. He trapped beaver and marten, collecting pelts he would sell when he made his next trip to the trading post. He cut firewood and stacked it against the cabin's north wall. By the time snow arrived in November, Thomas felt prepared. He had shelter, food, and fuel. He had survived his first season in the wilderness. Winter passed slowly but without disaster. Thomas kept his fire burning, rationed his supplies carefully, and waited for spring. When the snow finally began melting in late March of 1852, he felt relieved. He had made it through. He could begin planting his garden soon, return to trapping, and continue building his life in the valley. The water came on April 3rd. Thomas woke to find the creek had overflowed during the night. The snowmelt from the mountains had swollen every waterway beyond its banks. Water spread across the valley floor, seeking the lowest ground. Thomas's cabin sat in its path. By mid-morning, water was seeping under his door. By afternoon, his dirt floor had turned to mud. By evening, he was standing in 3 inches of water that showed no signs of receding. Thomas spent that night moving his supplies to his sleeping platform, trying to keep everything above the rising water. The cabin's walls held, but water continued flowing under the door and through gaps in the log base. His floor became a shallow pond. His carefully stacked firewood soaked through. His stored food, anything he had left on the ground, was ruined. The water finally receded after 2 days, leaving behind mud, debris, and the stench of rot. Thomas stood in his destroyed cabin and realized he had built in the wrong location. Thomas was not alone in the Bitterroot Valley. By the spring of 1852, 11 families had established homesteads within a day's ride of each other. They formed a loose community bound by shared isolation and mutual dependence. The nearest established town was Fort Owen, 3 days south by horseback. Everything else was wilderness. The families helped each other during harvests, shared news when they crossed paths, and gathered occasionally for celebrations or emergencies. They were scattered across the valley floor, each family claiming land near water sources that made survival possible. The settlement had started 2 years earlier when the first 3 families arrived following reports of good land and plentiful game. Others followed gradually, drawn by the same promises of independence and opportunity. Most were young couples starting families. A few were single men like Thomas seeking fortunes in furs or hoping to establish ranches. They came from different places with different backgrounds, but they shared common knowledge about frontier survival. They knew how to hunt, trap, build, and endure. They passed this knowledge between them without question because it had kept people alive for generations. Cabin construction followed universal patterns. Everyone built the same way because that was how it was done. Logs were cut from nearby timber, usually pine or spruce. The logs were notched and stacked. Gaps were chinked with whatever material was available. Roofs were simple affairs of poles and bark. Doors were basic. Windows were rare. Floors were packed earth because wooden floors required milled lumber that no one had access to. The cabins went up quickly, usually in less than 2 weeks, and they served their purpose adequately for most of the year. But every spring brought the same problem. When mountain snow melted rapidly, the creeks overflowed. Water spread across the valley floor following terrain that was difficult to read when the ground was dry. Cabins that seemed safely positioned in summer became islands in spring. Water seeped under walls, turned dirt floors to mud, and created conditions that ruined supplies and made living spaces miserable for days or weeks depending on the severity of the melt. The settlers accepted this as part of frontier life. They built their cabins near water because they needed access to creeks. They built on flat ground because it was easier than building on slopes. They built quickly because time was precious and winter came fast. The spring flooding was inconvenient, sometimes destructive, but not catastrophic enough to kill anyone. People endured it, cleaned up afterward, and continued with their lives. Thomas met his neighbors gradually during his first year. He helped Daniel Pritchard repair a barn roof damaged by heavy snow. He traded venison with the Harrison family for vegetables from their garden. He attended a community gathering at the McAllister cabin where families shared food and news. Everyone was friendly and helpful. They welcomed Thomas into their informal community and offered advice about surviving in the valley. When they learned about his flooded cabin, they sympathized but offered no solutions. Spring flooding happened to everyone. You just dealt with it and moved on. The spring of 1853 brought worse flooding than the previous year. Thomas had rebuilt his cabin on slightly higher ground, but water still found its way inside. This time, he was better prepared. He had elevated his sleeping platform higher and stored critical supplies above floor level. The water only reached 2 inches deep instead of 3, and it receded faster. But the damage was still significant. His floor remained muddy for a week. Several beaver pelts he had stored near the wall were ruined by moisture. His spare boots left on the floor were soaked beyond repair. Thomas visited Daniel Pritchard's homestead after the water receded and found similar conditions. Daniel's cabin had flooded worse than Thomas's because it sat in a slight depression that concentrated water flow. Daniel was shoveling mud from his floor when Thomas arrived. His wife Martha was hanging soaked blankets to dry in the sun. Their 2 young children played outside, splashing in puddles that remained scattered across their yard. Daniel greeted Thomas with weary frustration, but no surprise. They talked about the flooding while working together to clean Daniel's cabin. Daniel explained this was his 3rd spring in the valley and 3rd flood. The first year had been mild. The second year had been worse. This year was the worst yet. He had already moved his cabin once, rebuilding on ground he thought was higher, but the water found him anyway. He was considering moving again, but was running out of obvious locations. Every spot near the creek seemed vulnerable. Thomas asked if anyone in the valley had figured out how to prevent the flooding. Daniel laughed without humor. There was no preventing it. You built near water because you needed water. The spring melt brought floods. That was simply how things worked. Some years were worse than others. You could try to predict water patterns, but the snow depth varied every winter, and the melt speed changed based on weather. There was no reliable way to know where water would go until it was already flowing. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas visited every homestead in the valley. He found the same story repeated with minor variations. The McAllister cabin had flooded. The Harrison place had flooded. The Cooper family, the Jamesons, the Whitfields, all had dealt with water inside their homes. Some had suffered more damage than others based on their locations, but everyone had experienced the problem. A few families had attempted solutions. The Coopers had built a low wall of stones around their cabin perimeter, but water simply flowed over it. The Jamesons had dug a shallow ditch on one side of their cabin to divert water, but it filled with debris and overflow during the peak melt. Nothing had worked effectively. Thomas returned to his own cabin thinking about what he had learned. The flooding was universal, accepted, and considered unsolvable. But acceptance did not satisfy him. Thomas could not stop thinking about water. He lay awake at night, listening to rain on his roof and imagining where the water went after it hit the ground. He walked the valley during his daily activities, studying terrain with new attention. He noticed subtle slopes, invisible to casual observation. He saw how water gathered in certain areas and avoided others. He began to understand that the valley floor was not truly flat, but rather a complex surface of minor elevations and depressions that controlled water movement in predictable ways. He started drawing maps on pieces of bark using charcoal from his fire. The maps were crude but functional. He sketched the creek's path through the valley, marked where each cabin sat in relation to the water, and noted which homesteads flooded worst each spring. Patterns emerged. Cabins in slight depressions flooded more severely. Cabins near bends in the creek, where water naturally spread during high flow, experienced worse conditions. Cabins on even minor rises, just a foot or two above the surrounding ground, fared better. Thomas began carrying a small notebook he had brought from civilization, but had not used. He recorded observations in careful handwriting. He noted that water always flowed downhill, obviously, but it followed specific paths determined by ground shape. When water encountered obstacles, it went around them or over them, depending on volume and force. During normal conditions, the creek stayed in its banks. During spring melt, the volume increased so dramatically that the creek could not contain the flow. The excess water had to go somewhere. It spread outward, following the path of least resistance. He realized something important. The spring flooding was not random. It was entirely predictable if you understood the terrain. Water would flow to the lowest available ground every time. Cabins built in those low areas would flood. Cabins built on higher ground would not. The solution seemed obvious: build higher. But there was a problem with that solution. Higher ground meant being farther from water sources. Hauling water uphill every day for cooking, cleaning, and drinking was exhausting work. There was a reason everyone built near the creek despite the flooding risk. Thomas considered this problem from every angle. He needed to be near water for practical reasons, but he needed to avoid flooding. These requirements seemed contradictory, unless there was a way to control where water went. During the third week of May, while checking his trap lines along the creek, Thomas noticed something that changed his thinking completely. A beaver dam had created a pond upstream from the valley. Water backed up behind the dam, then flowed over it in a controlled manner. But around the edges of the pond, the beavers had dug channels through the mud. These channels directed excess water away from the dam structure itself, protecting it from erosion and ensuring the dam remained stable even during high water. Thomas stood watching those channels for nearly an hour. The beavers had engineered a solution to water control using nothing but instinct and labor. They had dug pathways that directed water where they wanted it to go. Thomas spent 3 weeks refining his plan before telling anyone. He sketched designs in his notebook, calculated angles and depths, and walked his property repeatedly to confirm his understanding of water flow patterns. The solution seemed clear to him now. If he dug trenches around his cabin foundation before building, he could control where water went during spring floods. The trenches would intercept water flowing toward the cabin and redirect it around the structure, channeling it away to lower ground beyond his homestead. The cabin floor would stay dry because water would never reach it. The concept was simple, but the execution would require significant labor. Thomas estimated He would need to dig approximately 80 feet of trench to encircle a cabin foundation completely. The trenches would need to be at least 2 feet deep and 18 inches wide. To handle peak water flow, they would need proper slope to ensure water kept moving rather than pooling. The excavated dirt could be used to raise the cabin foundation slightly, adding another layer of protection. The entire system would work together as an integrated defense against flooding. On June 12, 1853, Thomas rode to Daniel Pritchard's homestead to share his idea. He found Daniel repairing fence rails that had been damaged when his horses pushed through them during a recent storm. Thomas helped with the repair work while explaining his trench concept. He described how beaver channels had inspired the design, how water could be controlled through deliberate excavation, and how a properly engineered drainage system would keep cabin floors permanently dry. Daniel listened politely but skeptically. He pointed out several concerns. Digging that much trench would take weeks of backbreaking labor. The trenches might fill with debris and become useless. Animals could fall into them. Children could get hurt playing near them. Winter snow would fill them, potentially creating ice problems. And most fundamentally, Daniel questioned whether the system would actually work as Thomas predicted. Water behavior during spring floods was chaotic and difficult to predict. A trench system might simply be bypassed by water flowing from unexpected directions. Thomas countered each objection with careful reasoning, but Daniel remained unconvinced. He wished Thomas luck, but said he would not invest that much effort in an unproven idea. Thomas thanked him for listening and rode to the McAllister homestead. He received a similar response there. Robert McAllister thought the concept was interesting but impractical. The labor investment was too large for uncertain benefit. Over the next week, Thomas spoke with every family in the valley. He explained his drainage trench concept to anyone who would listen. The reactions ranged from polite interest to open dismissal. No one was willing to help dig or to attempt similar systems on their own properties. Several people suggested Thomas was overthinking a problem that did not require such elaborate solutions. A few questioned whether he had better uses for his time. The Harrison family nicknamed the idea Brennan's Moat. Others began calling Thomas Trench Tom in conversations he was not part of but heard about later. The name stuck and spread. The mockery started casually but intensified as Thomas continued discussing his drainage plan throughout the summer. At a community gathering in late July, someone made a joke about Thomas digging trenches to keep Indians out like a fort. Everyone laughed. Thomas tried to explain again that the trenches were for water control, not defense, but his explanation only generated more jokes. Someone suggested he should dig a moat all the way around the valley. Another person wondered if he planned to fill his trenches with alligators. The laughter was not mean-spirited initially, but it stung nonetheless. As weeks passed, the teasing became more pointed. When Thomas encountered neighbors during trips to check trap lines or hunt game, they asked about his moat project with exaggerated curiosity. Had he started digging yet? How deep would the trenches go? Would he need a drawbridge to enter his cabin? The questions were meant to highlight how ridiculous they found the entire concept. Thomas answered honestly at first, providing technical details about slope calculations and drainage capacity. But his serious responses only made the mockery worse. People began avoiding technical conversations with him, dismissing his explanations as unnecessary complications. Daniel Pritchard remained friendly, but made his skepticism clear. During one conversation in August, he told Thomas bluntly that the drainage trenches were a waste of time and energy. Spring floods were temporary inconveniences, not disasters worth preventing through months of ditch digging. The labor Thomas planned to invest could be better spent hunting, trapping, improving his cabin's interior, or clearing more land for crops. Daniel meant well with this advice. He genuinely believed Thomas was making a mistake and wanted to help him see reason before he invested too much effort in a failed project. Others were less kind. The younger Cooper brothers started calling Thomas Ditch Digger whenever they crossed paths. The nickname spread among the valley's younger men, who found the whole situation amusing. Thomas heard himself referred to as the man who fights floods with shovels. Someone created an elaborate story about Thomas planning to dig trenches across the entire territory to control all water flow everywhere. The story was obvious fiction, but was repeated at gatherings for entertainment value. Martha Pritchard, Daniel's wife, approached Thomas at a community meal in early September with genuine concern. She asked if he was feeling well, if isolation was affecting his thinking, if he needed to visit Fort Owen to spend time around more people. Her kindness was touching, but also insulting. She believed his trench obsession indicated mental instability brought on by too much solitude. Thomas assured her he was fine and thinking clearly, but she looked doubtful. The mockery reached its peak when someone painted a crude sign and left it near Thomas's cabin. The sign read, "Brennan's Fort," in rough letters. Thomas found it leaning against a tree near his property line. He did not know who had made it or placed it there. He burned it without comment, but the message was clear. The entire community thought his drainage trench plan was foolish. Thomas decided to build his new cabin in October, when the mockery had become unbearable and his resolve had hardened into determination. He would prove his concept worked through demonstration, not argument. If the community would not listen to his explanations, they would have to acknowledge results. He spent 2 weeks scouting locations with more care than he had invested in any previous decision. Every factor mattered now. He was not just selecting a building site. He was choosing ground where his reputation would be validated or destroyed. The location he finally selected surprised everyone who learned about it. Thomas chose a spot nearly 100 yards from the creek, positioned on a gentle rise that elevated the ground approximately 3 feet above the surrounding valley floor. The rise was subtle enough that most people would not notice it without careful observation, but Thomas had measured it precisely. That 3-foot elevation made enormous difference for water flow patterns. During spring floods, water would naturally flow around this rise rather than over it. The distance from the creek was the controversial element. 100 yards meant hauling water for all daily needs across that distance. Every bucket for cooking, cleaning, and drinking would require a walk to the creek and back carrying weight. In winter, that walk would be through snow. In summer, heat, it would be exhausting. The extra effort would accumulate over years into thousands of additional hours of labor. Most homesteaders built within 20 or 30 yards of water sources specifically to avoid this burden. Thomas had calculated this cost and accepted it. The inconvenience of hauling water was manageable and predictable. Spring floods were unpredictable and potentially devastating. He would rather invest steady daily effort than face disaster every spring. The elevation and distance from the creek would provide natural protection even without his trench system. But Thomas planned to add the trenches anyway, creating layered defenses that would make flooding absolutely impossible. He marked the cabin's footprint using stakes and rope, creating a rectangle measuring 14 feet by 16 feet. The structure would be slightly larger than his current cabin, providing more interior space for supplies and living. He oriented the cabin so the door faced south, maximizing sunlight in winter and providing clear views of approaching visitors. The placement on the rise gave him excellent sight lines in all directions. He could see anyone approaching long before they reached his property. Next, Thomas marked the trench system. He drove stakes around the cabin footprint at a distance of 6 feet from where the walls would stand. The trench would form a complete rectangle around the foundation with extensions at 2 corners that would carry water away downslope. The total length of trench to be excavated was approximately 95 feet. Thomas calculated that digging would require at least 30 days of full-time labor, probably longer given the difficulty of excavating rocky soil. He began work on October 20, 1853. choosing to dig trenches first before building the cabin itself. The first shovel of dirt came out of the ground on a cold morning with frost still coating the grass. Thomas began at the northwest corner of his marked foundation, driving his spade into soil that resisted with every thrust. The ground had started its seasonal freeze, making excavation significantly harder than summer digging would have been. But Thomas could not wait for spring. He needed the trench system completed, and the cabin built before winter made construction impossible. He had perhaps 6 weeks of workable weather remaining. The physical demands exceeded even his pessimistic estimates. Thomas was strong from years of frontier labor, accustomed to splitting wood, hauling game, and working from dawn until dark. But trench digging required sustained effort of a specific kind that exhausted muscles he did not normally use. He worked in a bent position, lifting shovel loads of dirt repeatedly, twisting to throw the excavated soil onto growing piles beside the trench. His back ached constantly. His hands developed blisters that burst and reformed as calluses. His shoulders burned with fatigue every evening. The soil composition varied frustratingly. Some sections were relatively soft earth that yielded to his shovel with reasonable effort. Other sections contained rocks ranging from fist-sized stones to boulders that required prying out with an iron bar he had brought specifically for that purpose. Tree roots crossed his planned trench line in multiple locations. He had to chop through them with an axe, then dig out the severed root sections before continuing. Progress was measured in feet per day rather than yards. Thomas established a routine to maintain steady progress despite the difficulty. He woke before dawn, ate a quick meal of cornmeal mush and dried meat, then worked on the trench until mid-morning. He rested for 30 minutes, drank water, ate more food, then returned to digging until early afternoon. Another rest period followed, then a final work session until darkness made further excavation impossible. He typically managed to dig between 8 and 12 feet of trench per day depending on soil conditions and obstacles encountered. Rain fell on the 4th day, turning the partially dug trench into a muddy channel and making work miserable. Thomas continued digging anyway, his clothes soaked, his boots caked with heavy mud that made every step difficult. He watched water flowing through the completed sections of trench and felt encouraged despite the discomfort. The water was already moving in the direction he had designed, following the slope he had carefully calculated. The system would work. By the end of the 2nd week, Thomas had completed approximately 70 feet of trench. The rectangular outline of his drainage system was becoming visible to anyone who visited his property. Several neighbors did visit, drawn by curiosity about his progress. They found Thomas in his trench, muddy and exhausted, methodically digging. Daniel Pritchard stopped by on the 10th day and stood watching for several minutes before speaking. He asked Thomas if he was absolutely certain this effort was worthwhile. Thomas climbed out of the trench, covered in dirt, and answered with complete conviction that it was. The trench dimensions reflected careful engineering rather than arbitrary choices. Thomas had calculated each measurement based on observations of water volume during previous spring floods and his understanding of flow dynamics learned from studying the creek. The main trench surrounding the cabin foundation measured 2 feet deep and 20 inches wide at the top, tapering slightly to 18 inches at the bottom. These proportions provided sufficient capacity to handle peak water flow while maintaining structural stability. Wider trenches would have required exponentially more digging. Shallower trenches would overflow during severe flooding. The trench depth of 2 feet was critical for multiple reasons. First, it placed the trench bottom below the frost line that developed during winter, preventing ice expansion from cracking and deforming the channel. Second, it provided adequate volume to contain water even when spring floods brought maximum flow. Thomas had measured water depth during the previous spring's worst flooding at 14 inches in the lowest areas. His 2-foot trench depth provided several inches of safety margin above that maximum. Third, the depth created enough vertical drop that water entering the trench would flow steadily rather than pooling or moving sluggishly. The slope of the trench floor required precision that most frontier construction ignored. Thomas had fashioned a simple leveling tool from a straight board, a string, and a weight. He used this device to ensure the trench bottom maintained consistent downward slope from the high points near the cabin's uphill corners toward the drainage outlets at the downhill corners. The slope was subtle, dropping only 6 inches over 40 feet, but it was sufficient to keep water moving. Too steep a slope would cause erosion. Too shallow would allow water to pool and stagnate. The drainage outlets were perhaps the most ingenious part of Thomas's design. At 2 corners of the rectangular trench system, he extended the channels outward from the main perimeter. These extensions ran 30 feet downslope from the cabin foundation, carrying water well beyond the immediate area. The extensions gradually widened from 20 inches to 36 inches, allowing water to spread and slow as it moved away from the cabin. This spreading prevented erosion at the outlet points and distributed water across a wider area where it could soak into the ground naturally. Thomas also incorporated overflow protection into his design. Along one side of the trench, he deliberately lowered the rim by 3 inches, creating a controlled overflow point. If water volume exceeded the trench's capacity during an exceptionally severe flood, water would spill over at this predetermined location, rather than at random points around the perimeter. The overflow point directed water away from the cabin toward open ground where flooding would cause no damage. The excavated dirt was not wasted. Thomas piled it carefully on the interior side of the trench, creating a raised berm around the cabin foundation. This berm elevated the ground level inside the perimeter by approximately 8 inches, adding another layer of protection. Even if water somehow entered the trench system, it would need to rise over 2 feet before threatening the cabin floor. The probability of that occurring was virtually zero. News of Thomas's progress spread through the valley during November. People who had initially dismissed his trench idea as temporary insanity now realized he was completely committed to the project. The trenches were real, nearly complete, and represented hundreds of hours of labor that Thomas had invested despite universal discouragement. The community's response shifted from amused mockery to active concern. Friends and neighbors began visiting with increasing frequency, not to help, but to convince Thomas to abandon what they perceived as a disastrous mistake. Robert McAllister arrived on a gray afternoon in mid-November with explicit purpose. He dismounted from his horse, greeted Thomas with strained friendliness, and asked to speak seriously. Robert explained that the entire valley was worried about Thomas. The trench obsession had gone too far. Thomas was exhausting himself with pointless labor when he should be preparing properly for winter. He had not hunted enough. His firewood supply was inadequate. His focus on drainage ditches had distracted him from essential survival tasks. Robert offered to help Thomas catch up on necessary preparations if Thomas would agree to stop digging and start thinking practically. Thomas appreciated the concern, but rejected the advice. He explained that his firewood was sufficient, his food supplies were adequate, and his winter preparations were complete despite time spent on trench work. He had simply worked longer hours and managed his time more efficiently than Robert realized. The trenches had not endangered his survival. They had required sacrifice of leisure time, not essential tasks. Robert left unsatisfied, convinced Thomas was deceiving himself about his readiness for winter. Martha Pritchard visited 3 days later with a different approach. She brought food, freshly baked bread, and smoked venison, claiming she had extra and thought Thomas might appreciate a good meal after his hard work. Her kindness was genuine, but her ulterior motive was transparent. While Thomas ate, Martha talked about her husband's concerns, about how the entire community felt protective of single men living alone who might lose perspective without family to ground them. She suggested Thomas consider spending the winter with another family rather than isolating himself in a cabin surrounded by trenches that served no purpose. The implication that he was mentally unstable bothered Thomas more than direct mockery had. He thanked Martha for the food and assured her politely but firmly that he was thinking clearly and would remain in his own cabin. She left looking worried, glancing back at the trenches with obvious disapproval. Thomas watched her ride away and felt a mixture of frustration and loneliness. The community's concern was touching in its way, but their inability to understand his logic was isolating. The younger men in the valley took a different approach. They continued mocking, but with an edge of cruelty that had not been present earlier. Someone spread a rumor that Thomas was digging trenches to bury treasure he had stolen. Another story claimed he was preparing fortifications because he expected an Indian attack that no one else knew about. Thomas completed the trench system on November 23rd and immediately began cabin construction. He had 6 weeks of workable weather remaining if he was lucky, perhaps only 4 if early winter storms arrived. The cabin needed to be finished and livable before deep snow made construction impossible. He worked with focused intensity, aware that every day mattered. The foundation was unconventional by frontier standards, reflecting the same careful engineering that had shaped his drainage system. He started by placing large flat stones inside the trench perimeter at the 4 corners and at intervals along where the walls would rest. These stones served as foundation piers, elevating the bottom logs above the raised ground level. The elevation was modest, only 6 inches, but it created an air gap under the cabin floor that would prevent moisture from wicking into the wood. Most frontier cabins sat directly on earth, allowing ground moisture to rot the bottom logs within a few years. Thomas's cabin would last decades because the wood never touched soil. The logs he selected were cut from standing dead pine trees that had dried naturally over several years. Green logs contained too much moisture and would shrink as they dried, creating gaps in the walls. Dead standing timber was already seasoned, dimensionally stable, and lighter to transport. Thomas spent 4 days cutting and hauling logs, selecting only trees that met his requirements for straightness and diameter. He rejected any log with excessive taper or visible rot. Corner construction followed traditional notched methods, but Thomas executed the notching with obsessive precision. Each notch was cut carefully to ensure tight fit with minimal gaps. He tested every joint before stacking the next log, adjusting cuts when fit was not perfect. The process was slow compared to typical cabin building, but the result was walls that stood perfectly plumb with almost no visible light between logs. Most frontier cabins showed daylight through gaps when viewed from inside. Thomas's walls looked nearly solid. Between each log, Thomas packed his custom chinking mixture. He had prepared this material weeks earlier, mixing clay from the creek bank with dried grass and pine resin he had collected and boiled down. The mixture had the consistency of thick paste when warm and could be worked into even small gaps. It dried hard but retained some flexibility, allowing it to move slightly with the logs during temperature changes without cracking. He applied chinking to every seam methodically, inside and outside, creating weatherproof walls. The roof construction followed the same principles of durability over speed. Thomas cut ridge poles from straight young pines, notched them to rest securely on the top wall logs, and spaced them closer together than standard practice required. Over these poles he laid split planks hewn flat on one side. The planks overlapped like shingles, with each row covering gaps in the row below. He pegged each plank to the ridge poles, using wooden pegs he had whittled during evening hours over the previous weeks. Over the planking, Thomas laid birch bark in multiple overlapping layers, then covered everything with sod. The completed roof was heavy, waterproof, and insulated. Snow would pile on it during winter without penetrating. Rain would run off without leaking. Thomas moved into his new cabin on December 15, 1853, 3 days before the first major snowstorm of winter arrived. The interior was sparse but functional. He had built a stone fireplace in the northeast corner, constructed a raised sleeping platform along one wall, and installed shelves for supplies. The floor was packed earth covered with split log planking he had hewn flat and fitted tightly together. The planks were not nailed down, simply laid in place, but they provided a solid surface that would remain stable regardless of ground moisture below. The cabin's position on its slight rise gave Thomas excellent views through his single window. He could see most of the valley floor, the creek, winding through scattered trees, and the mountains rising in the distance. He could see weather approaching long before it arrived. He could see visitors riding toward his property with enough advance notice to prepare appropriate responses. The elevation that made water hauling more difficult provided advantages that compensated for the inconvenience. The trench system surrounded his cabin like a dry moat. Snow had begun filling it, softening its sharp edges, making it less visible but still obviously present. Neighbors who passed by on their way to other destinations could see the trenches clearly. Most shook their heads at the sight. A few stopped to examine the system more closely, walking the perimeter, looking at the drainage outlets, trying to understand what Thomas had built. They inevitably concluded it was elaborate but pointless engineering that proved nothing except Thomas's stubborn refusal to accept conventional wisdom. Daniel Pritchard visited on a cold afternoon in late December, ostensibly to check on Thomas before winter isolation set in. They talked about hunting, weather predictions, and plans for the coming year. Daniel did not mention the trenches directly, but his disapproval was evident in how he avoided looking at them. Before leaving, Daniel offered advice that was meant kindly, but stung nonetheless. He suggested Thomas should consider filling in the trenches before spring. The excavated dirt was piled nearby and could be easily returned to the holes. Filling them in would save Thomas the embarrassment of having a failed experiment visible to everyone when his floor flooded, just like every other cabin in the valley. Thomas thanked Daniel for his concern, but declined the suggestion. He would not fill in the trenches. He would wait for spring and let results speak. Daniel left shaking his head, clearly convinced Thomas was making a terrible mistake. That evening, sitting alone in his new cabin, with fire crackling in the stone fireplace, Thomas felt the weight of community judgment pressing on him. He was completely isolated now in his belief that the trench system would work. Not a single person in the valley supported his project or expected it to succeed. The winter passed slowly. Thomas hunted, when weather permitted, maintained his trap lines, and kept his cabin warm. He hauled water from the creek daily, walking the 100 yards each direction multiple times depending on his needs. The extra distance was noticeable but manageable. His water buckets had rope handles that distributed weight comfortably across his shoulders. The first signs of spring melt appeared in early March of 1854. Temperatures rose above freezing during daylight hours, dropping back below freezing at night. This cycle created conditions that slowly released water from the snowpack without overwhelming creeks immediately. Thomas watched carefully, aware that the true test of his drainage system would come when temperatures stayed warm long enough to trigger rapid melting. The trenches were filled with compacted snow that had accumulated over 4 months. That snow would melt and either flow away through the drainage outlets or pool and create exactly the flooding conditions Thomas had worked so hard to prevent. By mid-March, the melt accelerated. Daytime temperatures reached into the 50s. Nights stayed above freezing. Snow disappeared from south-facing slopes first, then from the valley floor. The creek began rising, swollen with runoff from higher elevations. Thomas visited the creek daily to measure water levels using a stick he had marked with inch increments. He recorded measurements in his notebook, comparing current levels to notes from previous springs. The water was rising faster than it had in 1852, but not as dramatically as in 1853. On March 20th, Thomas noticed water beginning to flow through his trench system. The snow inside the trenches had melted enough to create liquid water at the bottom of the channels. That water followed the slope Thomas had engineered, moving slowly at first, then with increasing speed as more snow melted. The drainage outlets carried water away from the cabin foundation exactly as designed. Thomas spent an hour watching the flow, adjusting his observations as light changed and water volume increased. Daniel Pritchard rode past Thomas's property on March 22nd and stopped to observe. He dismounted and walked to the edge of the trench, looking down at water flowing steadily through the channel. He asked Thomas how deep the water was running. Thomas estimated 4 to 6 inches at that point, well below the trench capacity of 2 feet. Daniel nodded but said nothing else. His expression suggested he was waiting for the system to fail rather than acknowledging early signs of success. The weather turned warmer during the final week of March. Temperatures reached the 60s for 3 consecutive days. Snow melted rapidly throughout the valley. The creek rose to levels approaching the previous year's peak. Water spread across low areas of the valley floor, seeking familiar paths it had followed during previous spring floods. Thomas watched from his elevated cabin position as water moved through the landscape, flowing around his rise, never approaching his foundation. The trenches carried runoff that drained from the slight slope his cabin occupied, channeling it efficiently to the drainage outlets. By March 30th, most of the valley's snow had melted. The creek was running high and fast, muddy brown with sediment. Water stood in shallow pools across low ground throughout the valley. Thomas walked to Daniel Pritchard's cabin and found water seeping under Daniel's door for the 3rd consecutive year. Daniel was building a temporary barrier from stacked firewood, trying to keep water from spreading deeper into his interior. He looked exhausted and frustrated. Thomas offered to help with the barrier, and together they managed to slow the water's advance. April began with unseasonably warm weather that caught the entire valley unprepared. Temperatures rose into the 70s for 5 straight days, melting the remaining snowpack in the mountains with shocking speed. The creek transformed from a swollen waterway into a raging torrent that overflowed its banks and spread across the valley floor in a sheet of moving water. This was flooding beyond anything Thomas had witnessed in his 3 years in Montana Territory. This was the kind of spring disaster that destroyed cabins, drowned livestock, and forced families to abandon homesteads. The water arrived at the valley settlements on the morning of April 4th. Thomas woke to the sound of rushing water and looked out his window to see the landscape transformed. Where dry ground had existed the previous evening, water now flowed in currents strong enough to bend grass and move small debris. The creek had disappeared into a wide expanse of brown water that covered everything below a certain elevation. Thomas's cabin, positioned on its rise with trenches carved around the foundation, sat like an island above the flood. He dressed quickly and went outside to examine his drainage system under extreme conditions. Water was pouring into his trenches from upslope, flowing through the channels at a speed that created visible currents. The trench depth of 2 feet was being tested fully. Water filled the channels to within 6 inches of the rim at the deepest points, but it never overflowed. The drainage outlets were discharging water in steady streams that spread across lower ground well away from the cabin. The system was working exactly as Thomas had calculated it would work, handling water volume that would have flooded any standard cabin foundation. Thomas spent the morning walking the trench perimeter, checking for erosion or structural problems. The channels showed some minor washing at the drainage outlets where fast-moving water had carved the soil slightly, but the damage was minimal and easily repaired. The raised berm of excavated dirt on the interior side of the trenches had settled somewhat, but still provided elevation that kept the cabin foundation well above any potential water level. Even if the trenches completely failed, water would need to rise another foot before threatening his floor. By midday, Thomas could see other cabins in the valley dealing with catastrophic flooding. The Pritchard cabin was surrounded by water that had risen above the door threshold. The McAllister place looked like it was sitting in a shallow lake. The Harrison cabin, built closest to the creek, had water flowing through it with enough force to carry away anything not secured. Families were evacuating to higher ground, carrying children and whatever supplies they could grab quickly. Livestock wandered through the water, confused and distressed. Thomas saddled his horse and rode through the flooded valley toward the nearest cabins. The water reached his horse's knees in the deepest areas, but was passable with careful navigation. He reached the Pritchard homestead and found Daniel and Martha loading their children onto a wagon, preparing to retreat to higher ground until the water receded. Daniel saw Thomas approaching and stared at him with an expression that mixed disbelief with dawning realization. The peak flooding occurred on April 7th, exactly as Thomas had recorded in his notebook based on careful observation of weather patterns and water flow. He woke before dawn to find the valley transformed into an inland sea that stretched from the foothills to the eastern boundary of settled land. Every cabin except his own was partially submerged. Water stood between 6 and 14 inches deep inside structures built on traditional foundations at ground level. Families had evacuated to temporary camps on high ground, taking what they could carry and leaving everything else to the mercy of the flood. Thomas's cabin remained completely dry. The trenches had handled 3 days of maximum water flow without failing. The drainage outlets continued discharging steady streams that carried runoff away from the foundation. The raised berm kept the cabin floor elevated above any theoretical water level. Thomas stood at his doorway and looked across the flooded valley, feeling vindication mixed with sympathy for his neighbors who had suffered exactly the disaster he had worked so hard to prevent for himself. By mid-morning, the first visitors arrived. Robert McAllister rode up on his horse, both of them muddy and exhausted from navigating flooded terrain. Robert dismounted and walked around Thomas's cabin slowly, examining the trench system that was clearly visible despite being filled with flowing water. He studied the drainage outlets, observed how water moved through the channels, and tested the stability of the raised berm with his boot. After completing his inspection, he asked Thomas to explain exactly how the system worked. Thomas walked Robert through the entire design, explaining slope calculations, trench dimensions, drainage outlet placement, and the function of the raised foundation. Robert listened with complete attention, asking technical questions about excavation depth, soil stability, and winter maintenance. The mockery and skepticism that had characterized previous conversations were gone entirely. Robert was learning from someone whose engineering had proven superior to conventional wisdom. Daniel Pritchard arrived an hour later with his family. Martha and the children waited outside while Daniel examined the trenches. He said nothing for several minutes, simply walking the perimeter and looking at how water flowed through Thomas's carefully engineered channels. When he finally spoke, his voice carried genuine respect and acknowledgement of error. He told Thomas directly that he had been wrong to dismiss the trench concept, wrong to discourage the work, and wrong to assume conventional methods were adequate. The evidence was undeniable. Thomas's floor was dry, while everyone else's was flooded. By afternoon, 7 families had visited Thomas's property. Some came seeking temporary shelter, which Thomas provided as best he could in his small cabin. Others came simply to see the drainage system functioning under actual flood conditions. Everyone asked questions. How deep were the trenches? How long had excavation taken? What tools were required? Could similar systems be built around existing cabins or only during new construction? Would the trenches work on flat ground or only on slopes? Thomas answered every question thoroughly, sharing his knowledge without reservation. He had not built the drainage system to prove superiority or claim special status. He had built it to solve a problem that affected everyone. The water receded slowly over the following week. By April 15th, the valley floor was visible again. though muddy and littered with debris carried by the flood. Families returned to their cabins to assess damage and begin cleanup. The destruction varied by location, but every home built using traditional methods had suffered. Floors were thick with mud, stored food was ruined, furniture had floated and damaged walls, clothing and bedding were soaked. The smell of rot and mildew permeated every interior space. Weeks of labor would be required to make the cabins livable again. Thomas's cabin required no cleanup. His floor remained dry and clean. His supplies were undamaged. He had lived normally throughout the flood, maintaining his routines without interruption. The contrast between his situation and everyone else's was impossible to ignore. The drainage trench system had performed flawlessly under the most extreme conditions the valley had experienced in recorded memory. The concept Thomas had proposed the previous summer, the idea that had generated universal mockery, had proven completely valid. Daniel Pritchard was the first to formally request help implementing a similar system. He visited Thomas on April 17th and asked directly if Thomas would be willing to design drainage trenches for the Pritchard property. Daniel offered to provide labor, materials, whatever Thomas needed in exchange for engineering expertise. He acknowledged that he had ridiculed the trench concept and admitted he had been foolish to dismiss innovation without understanding the underlying principles. He wanted to prevent his family from enduring another spring flood. Thomas agreed immediately. He rode to the Pritchard homestead the next day and spent several hours studying the terrain, water flow patterns, and cabin positioning. The site presented different challenges than his own property. The Pritchard cabin sat in a slight depression that naturally collected water. Simply digging perimeter trenches would not solve the problem completely. Thomas designed a more complex system that included perimeter trenches, an upslope diversion channel to intercept water before it reached the depression, and multiple drainage outlets that would carry water to different discharge points. The excavation work began in late April, when ground had dried enough to make digging practical. Daniel provided labor, and Thomas provided engineering oversight. They worked together for 3 weeks, digging approximately 120 feet of trenches total. Thomas taught Daniel how to maintain proper slope, how to test drainage flow, and how to identify and correct problems before they became serious. By mid-May, the Pritchard property had a functioning drainage system that would protect the cabin during future floods. Word of the Pritchard project spread quickly. Robert McAllister requested similar help. Then the Harrison family asked Thomas to design a system for their property. The younger Cooper brother, who had been among the most vocal mockers the previous year, appeared at Thomas's cabin and apologized sincerely before asking if Thomas would consider helping his family as well. By early June, Thomas had commitments to design drainage systems for 8 different properties throughout the valley. The work consumed his entire summer. Thomas rode from property to property, studying terrain, calculating slopes, and marking trench lines. The summer of 1854 transformed the Bitterroot Valley's approach to cabin construction. What had been considered Thomas's eccentric obsession became accepted standard practice within a single season. The dramatic success of his drainage system during April's catastrophic flooding convinced even the most skeptical settlers that trench engineering was not just useful but essential for long-term survival in the valley. Thomas found himself functioning as an informal consultant and teacher, spending more time designing drainage systems for others than managing his own traplines and homestead work. Each property presented unique challenges that required customized solutions. The Harrison cabin sat on nearly flat ground, with poor natural drainage. Thomas designed a system that incorporated a raised foundation platform in addition to perimeter trenches, essentially rebuilding the cabin's base to elevate it 18 inches above original grade. The excavated dirt from the trenches provided material for the platform. The result was a cabin that sat visibly higher than surrounding ground, protected by both elevation and drainage channels. The McAllister property required different engineering. Their cabin was positioned near a natural swale where water concentrated during heavy runoff. Perimeter trenches alone would be overwhelmed by the volume of water flowing through that swale during peak conditions. Thomas designed an upstream interception trench that diverted water around the entire homestead area before it could threaten the cabin. The interception trench ran nearly 200 feet and required a full month of excavation work, but it solved the flooding problem completely by redirecting water flow at its source. The Cooper family presented perhaps the most interesting challenge. They had built their cabin on what appeared to be high ground, but spring floods still reached their foundation because water flowed toward them from multiple directions simultaneously. Thomas designed a network of smaller trenches that intercepted water from different approach angles, channeling each flow to separate drainage outlets. The system looked complex compared to simple perimeter trenches, but it addressed the specific hydraulic conditions of their location. Thomas taught the engineering principles to anyone willing to learn. He explained how to read terrain for water flow patterns, how to calculate appropriate trench depths based on expected flood volumes, how to establish and maintain proper slope for continuous drainage, and how to position outlets to prevent erosion. Some settlers grasped the concepts quickly and could design their own systems after one demonstration. Others needed repeated explanation and hands-on guidance. Thomas provided whatever level of instruction each person required. By September, 8 properties in the valley had functioning drainage systems. 3 more families had begun excavation work and would complete their trenches before winter. The physical transformation of the valley was visible to anyone traveling through. Cabins that had previously sat directly on ground level were now surrounded by engineered trenches or elevated on raised platforms. The landscape showed evidence of systematic water management rather than passive acceptance of seasonal flooding. The cultural transformation was equally significant. Conversations among settlers shifted from accepting spring floods as inevitable to discussing prevention strategies. Newcomers arriving in the valley received advice about drainage engineering from multiple sources. The phrase "built like Brennan's place" became shorthand for construction that incorporated proper water management. Thomas Brennan lived in his cabin for 17 years, from 1853 until 1870, when he sold his property and moved to Oregon Territory to be near family. During those years, he witnessed the complete transformation of frontier construction practices throughout the Bitterroot Valley and surrounding regions. The drainage trench concept that had generated mockery in its early stages became standard engineering knowledge passed between settlers as casually as advice about crop rotation or hunting techniques. What had been innovation became tradition within a single generation. The spring floods continued arriving every year with varying severity. The flood of 1857 was nearly as bad as the disaster of 1854. The flood of 1862 set records that stood for decades, but cabins built with proper drainage systems survived these events without interior flooding. Families who had invested labor in trench excavation and raised foundations stayed dry and comfortable, while others who had ignored or delayed implementing water management solutions dealt with recurring damage and displacement. The technique spread beyond the Bitterroot Valley through travelers, traders, and settlers who moved between communities carrying knowledge with them. By the early 1860s, drainage trenches were appearing around cabins in valleys throughout western Montana. The specific designs varied based on local conditions and individual understanding, but the core principle remained constant. Water could be controlled through deliberate engineering rather than simply endured as an unavoidable hardship. Thomas never sought recognition or profit from his innovation. He shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked, helped design systems without charging fees, and taught the principles to others so they could work independently. His motivation had never been fame or financial gain. He had simply wanted to solve a problem that made frontier life unnecessarily difficult. The satisfaction of seeing his solution adopted widely was reward enough. Modern historians studying frontier settlement patterns note the Bitterroot Valley as an example of rapid technological adaptation driven by practical necessity. The drainage trench systems represented applied engineering principles that were sophisticated for their time and place, developed not by trained engineers but by observant individuals willing to challenge conventional assumptions. The speed with which the innovation spread demonstrated how frontier communities shared useful knowledge when results were undeniable. The cabin Thomas built in 1853 stood until 1923, when it was finally demolished to make way for a modern ranch house. The drainage trenches remained visible in the landscape for decades after the cabin disappeared, shallow depressions in the ground that marked where water had once been carefully controlled. Old-timers in the valley remembered stories about Trench Tom, who had dug ditches while everyone laughed, then proved his critics wrong when the floods came and his floor stayed bone dry. The impossible had become ordinary. A cabin that never flooded was no longer remarkable, but expected. Thomas Brennan's obsessive solution to a problem everyone else accepted had changed how an entire region built shelter, one trench at a time, proving that sometimes the best innovations come from refusing to accept that things have to be the way they have always been.